Does that sound good?
I mean, yeah, that's fine.
Okay. All right. So we are recording now.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to our very first digital installment of our adult speaker program. So we're doing things a little differently this summer. I think everyone, just this whole year is going a little differently for everyone. So we're trying our hand at online programming. And so to kick us off this summer on our very first day of summer reading, actually, is Mel Zabecki from the Arkansas Archaeological Survey. And I will toss it over to Mel because she has lots of interesting things to tell us today.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me. And I don't know a whole heck of a lot about your actual summer reading program or what the theme, what everybody's going to take away from the theme. But when Bailey told me about the theme, I thought, well, we tell stories all the time as archaeologists. And I could think of one particular time where the story that we told for many, many years actually changed with the discovery of some new information. So I wanted to do a play on your theme and say, imagine their story. And I'm going to start sharing my screen if I can remember how to do that kind of thing on Zoom. Let's see. Share screen. We're all going to work through this together. So somebody let me know if I'm messing this up. But in theory, it should start sharing the screen, and you should be able to see my slideshow, Imagine Their Story. How an archaeological investigation in Egypt changed the story of an ancient city. Thanks, Bailey, for letting me know that the screen is shared. So I'm going to talk. I'm starting my timer right now. I think I'm just going to keep this I'm going to try to keep it at a half an hour. I may wind up going a little bit over. I can talk for many, many hours about all of this stuff, but I've got my timer started, and I just want to try to keep it at that. For anybody that might be watching this later, so you don't have to sit for a whole hour and listen to me drone on. So basically, I'm going to be talking about one site in general, and what its importance has been and what it turned into archaeologically. And I wanted to first mention, I have to put this warning up that I have lots of pictures of human remains in this, both mummified and skeletonized. And so if you feel, or if somebody in your party that might be watching this later, if you feel like this would upset you or make you feel very uncomfortable, I'd suggest discontinuing it. The first few slides do not have pictures, but just in case, I know some folks, may be offended by these kinds of things. So I wanted to warn you up front. Now, I know this looks crazy right here. I'm not going to have crazy slides with insane numbers and letters all over the place, but I needed to show you the Egyptian chronology first. A lot of people, kind of lump ancient Egypt all into one big giant category, and I want you to understand that ancient Egypt goes back a very, very long ways. Even though the Egypt that you think of as ancient Egypt wasn't actually that long ago, there have been people in Egypt for hundreds of thousands of years, back to the very earliest humans, and even pre-humans lived there as well. But when we talk about ancient Egypt, most people are thinking about the pharaonic period. And so the pharaonic period really starts at the early dynastic, which is the fourth number down, or the fourth line down, at about 3000 BC, or some people say 3150 BC. So when we talk about the pharaonic era and the pharaohs and hieroglyphics and mummies and blah, 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 we're looking at the early, starting at 3150 BC or BCE, which means before Common Era. It's a kind of a new terminology that people have been using lately. Now, the Old Kingdom is when we have all the big pyramids being built. Okay, so I'm just trying to give you sort of an idea of where we're going to be talking about in the grand scheme of Egyptology. The Old Kingdom is when you have the big pyramids built, and that's sort of a weird time where there was still a lot of a separation between the pharaoh and the common people, and Egypt was kind of insulated in terms of they didn't have large armies or anything like that. But as time went on, and as people were traveling further away and trading and learning about other peoples and interacting, they started to pick up some outside things like horses. Okay, so there weren't any horses during the Old Kingdom or the First Intermediate, or even they started coming in sort of in the Middle Kingdom to the Second Intermediate period. So if you look down the list, you'll see one called the New Kingdom. And the New Kingdom is where we're going to be talking about today. The New Kingdom has your iconic King Tut head next to it, because this is when the pharaohs were very, very rich, powerful. However, they didn't have pyramids. They built inside the Valley of the Kings where their tombs were, because they were hidden. Because basically, as my first Egyptology professor stated, a pyramid is a giant neon sign saying, "I'm buried here, come steal my stuff." So the after the Middle Kingdom, they had really sad pyramids, but then the New Kingdom pharaohs were like, okay, everybody's pyramids are getting robbed, let's put our tombs somewhere else. So they put them in the Valley of the Kings. So this is the one where King Tut is buried in, and everybody knows about this one. New Kingdom also was a time when the army grew. Egypt was starting to become an empire. Okay, so the pharaohs were known throughout the old world, all the way up through Syria and Jordan, or the land that now is Syria and Jordan, all the way down into the Sudan, across to Libya, and they were starting to attract a lot of people that were using Egypt as sort of the breadbasket, and they felt the Egyptians were kind of taking over the known world at that time. So it was a very, very rich period in Egypt, and we can tell that from a lot of the tombs from the Valley of the Kings, and a lot of the temples and things. The giant temples that you know of from Egypt were built during this period. So it was a very, very prosperous time for Egypt for the most part. Now, the time we're actually going to be talking about is something called the Amarna period, and I'll explain where Amarna comes from in a second. But this guy named Amenhotep IV was one of the kings of the New Kingdom, and he just followed in the line of other Amenhoteps and Ramses and these other kings that were in this long line of kings. But in the middle of this whole period, Amenhotep IV just goes crazy and decides to change his name to Akhenaten, which means the spirit of the Aten. And Akhenaten is, he broke the chain with Amun through leaving his Amenhotep name behind. And he took the name of the Aten, and the Aten becomes the singular god. I'll talk about the Aten in just a second. I'll show you a picture of the sun disk, which is the new god. But basically, he not only changed the religion during his reign, but he also changed the capital of Egypt. And so the capital city was moved to a place called Akhenaten, which means the horizon of the Aten, not Akhenaten, which is the spirit of the Aten, okay? So it's kind of confusing, but Akhenaten, which is also a place called Tel El Amarna. Nowadays, if you look on the top right-hand side of that map, it says Tel El Amarna. Amarna is the place in Egypt now, the name of the current city. So Tel El Amarna is a city that is ancient, and then there's also actually towns that surround it. So if you look in the very middle of the map, there's El Hajj Kandil, and Hajj Kandil is a place that people live in today. Okay, so it's kind of a couple of towns that are surrounded by the ancient city, and the ancient city was occupied in the mid 1300s, and it was only occupied, as far as we could tell, for 15 or 20 years. So it was occupied during a very short period of time, and that sort of people think that the place itself was an important place, that Akhenaten put it in that place because it actually was a place that was right in between Cairo, or really Memphis, which was during the New Kingdom, it was the religious capital of Egypt, and it was the original capital of Egypt, Memphis, where they had all the pyramids, and also in between Memphis, the religious capital, and then Luxor, which was actually more of the the bureaucratic capital of Egypt during the New Kingdom. So we think that Akhenaten actually chose a space in between those two cities, or in between those two capitals, to put his new town where no other god or goddess had trampled upon the land with their temples. So they think that it was sort of a strategic move, or a symbolic move, to the middle of nowhere, in between these capitals, far away from everything. And actually, it turns out that he put his town really in a spot that was not a great place for farming. There are places in the Nile that have thicker and thinner areas of cultivation, or where all the silt gets dropped. So it wasn't actually like the best place in the world, but I think we think he did it symbolically because it was in between those two capitals to make a statement. Okay. So what he did was he instituted the worship of a single god named the Aten. And the Aten is the visual sun disk in the sky. So in this picture, we have on the left is Akhenaten. On the right is his main queen, Nefertiti. I'm sure you've heard of that name before. And then on their laps are pictures of 3 of their daughters. And we see, I'm going to admit somebody. Yay, Lynn Atkins is coming in. Now I have to figure out how to admit. All right. Oh, and by the way, folks, if you have questions while you're listening to me blather on, please put the any questions you have in the chat box, and then Bailey or I will get to that in a little bit. After I talk, we'll address any of those questions, okay? Because I know sometimes you come up with a question and you say I'll ask later, but then you're like, oh, I forgot what the question is. So write it down, whatever you want, and if it gets answered, that's great, and if it doesn't get answered by the end, we'll answer it. So I'm trying to make sure that Lynn is actually in the meeting. I said come on in, and I hit admit, but now I'm assuming she's in. I would hate to leave her out, but I'm trying to hit admit, and it's hold on. Does anybody know?
I hit admit on Lynn, and it looks like she's joining.
Okay.
I don't know if it's still connecting or what.
Thank you, Bailey. I'm trying to keep my screen large because I didn't want to mess up anybody's view of the screen. So we'll just kind of assume that she's in, and maybe we can just, Bailey, if you just want to keep hitting admit, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. So anyway, this picture of the royal family at a point in time showing the Aten, which is the visual sun disk in the sky. And what I love most about the pictures of the Aten is that whenever you have the Aten, which is the sun disk, there's always the rays coming down with hands, okay, these little cute little hands. But when the hands are right in front, whatever hand is right in front of one of the royal members, the hand is holding an ankh, the sign of life. So that's my favorite thing about the Aten, is that they always show these little ankhs. So you see the 2 at Akhenaten and one of his daughters, and then there's 2 that are in front of Nefertiti and one of the baby daughters, and then the one on Nefertiti's lap, I'm not quite sure if there's an ankh or not, but basically, I just love that. So also, I don't know how much y'all know about ancient Egypt, but this is a really weird picture. There's multiple reasons. You know what? There's multiple reasons why it's weird. I don't know if I really have time to go through it, but basically, this is not typical of ancient Egyptian art, okay? But maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. But let me move on about other things that Akhenaten did. In his city, he actually bounded his city with these things called boundary stela. It's like a giant headstone. Some of them were carved into the rock and some of them were freestanding. But basically they said, like in hieroglyphics, like, this is the northern border of the city of Tel El Amarna, of Akhenaten, and you are now entering this area and you are only to worship the Aten. And like things like that. So you can see the letters A, B, where's C? I don't know where C. Some of them are unknown or lost or something like that. But basically there's 3 known on the West Bank, and then the white thing in the middle is the Nile, and then on the right hand side where all that topography is the West Bank, where the actual city is, and you can see all those letters. And he marked out the boundaries, which I don't think any other Egyptian city has that. So pretty interesting thing. He also had a lot of architectural changes. So there were, instead of large giant building blocks, they built in these things called talatat, which is basically like blocks that were, I don't know, maybe the size of 4, maybe 6, imagine 6 shoe boxes, like 3, imagine 12, 3, 6, 9, 12. Imagine 12 shoe boxes maybe. They're kind of long, narrow blocks that they would build with instead of using giant, huge things. And then they stacked them up, and then they did their inscriptions on that inside the temple and stuff like that. So architectural changes, artistic changes. Akhenaten is known for his strange appearance. His father was too, actually. Amenhotep III looks a little bit different too. But, people told stories about Akhenaten. My favorite story again, my first Egyptology professor said, okay, so here's a regular Egyptian king. This is actually, I think, Mycerinus. He's the Armenkauret. He's the owner of the smallest pyramid. It might be Khephren, might be the middle pyramid. But anyway, those three big pyramids at Giza, he's one of those. And so, you know, typical Egyptian pharaoh, young looking, spry, symmetrical, regular person, right? And so this is what your typical Egyptian pharaoh looks like. And then you have Akhenaten, who you've already seen a picture, but here's another one of Akhenaten. And my first Egyptology professor said, so this is the pharaoh formerly known as Akhenaten, who looks strangely like the person formerly known as Prince. So we always made this joke that he kind of looked like Prince, and he was just this, you know, this interesting, eccentric dude. Now, the story that people told about Akhenaten, there have been medical doctors that have tried to say he had Marfan syndrome because he had these long fingers and sort of a belly kind of thing, and you know, just he was an odd-looking character, so he assumed that or people assume that he had some kind of a syndrome, okay? And the fact that he was married to Nefertiti was another very popular story that was told, because here's Nefertiti's bust in the Berlin Museum. Most people are very familiar with this picture. And so he was always kind of a famous pharaoh just because of like what he looked like and who he was married to, okay? But it was all about appearances, because we've never found anybody. Oh, and also one other thing, let me go back for a second. You see the girls, the daughters, how elongated the back of their heads are. A lot of people for many, many years told stories that that they practiced head binding. And I mean, I've honestly seen it in history books that the ancient Egyptians participated in head binding of their babies for beauty purposes during the Amarna period. It's not true. We've never found a bound skull ever in any of the cemeteries we've dug up from that time period. So again, I think this was just a historic, a symbolic, artistic thing that was to make them stand out. Okay, all of these things that he did was to tell a different kind of story about the ancient Egyptian royal family and the people that were involved in it. So we still know that these people lived in the New Kingdom, and we know that Egypt was very, very prosperous during this period. We're getting all kinds of incredible luxury goods come in, you know, made of materials that ancient Egypt didn't have at the time. And, you know, since there's no Amazon.com, you know, that they were working really hard to get lapis lazuli from the area of Afghanistan, you know, different kinds of things like that. Gold, of course, from the Sudan. There's no gold in Egypt. Yet, you know, your King Tut mask and half of his stuff is made out of gold, right? So they were very, very prosperous. Oh, and by the way, I forgot the other member of the royal family. It was King Tut. So King Tutankhamun was actually born king, or not born as a king. He was born with the name Tutankhaten. And most people don't really realize that after his father supposedly Akhenaten died, he changed his name to Tutankhamun to orient himself with the original creator god of Egypt, the Amun. So that's a really cool symbolic thing that he did, was that he disassociated himself with Akhenaten, because actually I think the religion didn't take, and the eccentricity of Akhenaten did not take. And there wasn't really that much indication of any problems in the archaeology up until 20 years ago, because most people just said, okay, it's just another capital city. Their tomb walls. Now, Tutankhamun, or King Tut, was buried in the Valley of the Kings. So he really doesn't have much association, except for in the royal line, they call him the son of Akhenaten. But we're not really sure. He's not Nefertiti's son. We don't know exactly how he's related. His mother might have been one of the other wives. They kept multiple wives, the pharaohs did. So, but anyway, basically, he disassociated himself because Akhenaten wasn't actually probably very popular. And again, we didn't get that indication until about 20 years ago in the archaeology. We still had a big city. There were rock-cut tombs for the elites that showed beautiful scenes of parties and wonderful, expensive things and lots of food piled on the tables. And everything looked like a typical royal city. That things were coming and going, there was trade, it was awesome. But then in about 2005, a cemetery became exposed. And then over the years, they sort of talked about a lot of different cemeteries. There was the Royal Wadi, which was where a wadi is a dried up riverbed or river valley. The Royal Wadi, like an arroyo in Western United States. The Royal Wadi was where the royal family tomb was. It had been destroyed and kind of washed out from flash flooding over years. So nothing was ever found in it. So we don't know if Akhenaten or Nefertiti were actually buried there or not. But then there's the north tombs and the south tombs. And those two, north tombs and then drop down to the next south tombs, are the elite tombs that are all across the rocks in the big rock cliffs that are to the east of Armana, or Tel Amarna. And then there were these other cemeteries that started to become exposed through wind-blown sand, like basically bones were just popping up in the desert. And in about 2005, my graduate advisor, Jerry Rose, went to the South Thames Cemetery to investigate and decide if it was going to be something that was worth digging. And a couple of test excavations later, realized that yes, even though there's bones on the surface, there's intact graves that we can indeed excavate and learn about the people of Amarna, to see if we can prove that they were living well, or see what other story was going to be told by the bones. And so I was a graduate student at the time, and I know this kind of sounds, this is like ancient history, but it still stands because the data collected 15 years ago up till 10 years ago at the South Tombs Cemetery really tells a really interesting story. So what I'm going to tell next is about the South Tombs Cemetery and what we learned. Now here's a picture of the bones laying on top of the surface, and it's, you know, a typical, there's rocks and sand and then human bones laying around. So you know that there's a cemetery there. But in order to figure out how big the cemetery is, you've got to kind of like go out and surface collect and figure out where the bones stop. And that's when you can kind of imagine that that's where the cemetery stops too. So we made kind of like decisions over the years. I think I spent 6 or 7 seasons there. I did mostly the bone analysis with students that came from the University of Arkansas and other places too. But basically we made decisions on where to dig, because you couldn't dig the whole cemetery. It would take years and years and years and years to dig the whole cemetery. There's probably 5,000 people in the cemetery. So we got about 400 to 500 people out of it. And that was over a number of 7 years. And just a quick showing of where the South Tombs Cemetery is, the bottom red arrow points at the South Tombs Cemetery just outside of the South Tombs, which are those elite rock cut tombs. So it's south and east of the central city there. And so the importance of the cemetery, and any of the cemeteries at Armana really, are that they're a temporal snapshot of like, basically there's a lot of archaeological sites that were lived on for thousands of years. So you get everything jumbled up. Since Amarna was only occupied for about 15 years, or maybe 20, but really about 15 for the main section of it, we know that this is 15 years worth of the population. It's not thousands of years where lots of things can change. It's a snapshot in time, and that's archaeologically unique. So that made it a very interesting thing to also, because it's Egypt, and it's because it is not covered over by agricultural fields yet that have been reclaimed into the desert. The skeletons are still really well preserved. Now, they're not as good as preserved as they would have been 50 years ago, because the water table is rising quickly in Egypt. So we did find a couple of mummies, but most of the mummified remains have given way to just being bones and hair and skin, little bits of skin or fingernails and things like that. But the skeletons themselves are still very well preserved. And also, we found out later, this isn't something we knew at the front end, was that we had all components of the population. We had all the young people all the way up to the very old people. So it was a really, what we consider sort of almost like a good cross-section of the population. Some cemeteries are sort of special use. Like there's another one, the North Tombs Cemetery. It's full of teenagers. It's very weird. So this was not a special use cemetery. This was like for everyone, we think. And so the graves themselves, just to give you a little bit about the cemetery, because it's fun to look at pictures of cemeteries. Well, for me, because I'm weird. But anyway, graves are in different orientations. It's not your typical, proper cemetery with everybody in lines. It was kind of a mess everywhere. But there you can see with the drawing a larger swath, but then the photograph shows, different orientations of the graves. Not everybody was buried in a line. There were also lots of variations of the graves, of the burials themselves. We had individual single burials. We had multiple burials of 2 and 3. And then people were buried sometimes in mats, sometimes people, we didn't have any coffins, but in different kinds of matting, different materials wrapped around. And some people had burial goods like pottery, jewelry, and some people didn't. For the most part, we didn't find very many burial goods, which is fine with me because all I care about is the bones. But a lot of these people were looted, especially the ones that were closer to the surface. People had looted them over the years. And we're talking, don't forget, this is like 3,000 years that people could be out in the desert looting. So 3,000 years is a long time to be in the ground. So, lots of looting happened. But here's some single burials. There's 2 stacked on, they're 2 pictures. I don't want you to think that they were buried together. It's just 2 separate pictures. You can see one actually had some sort of coffin-like box because it's a square. But most of that kind of stuff just kind of fell apart. But then the person on the bottom, actually the person on the bottom was buried face down. And we think that was probably just due to the fact that they might have got rattled around in the matting that they were carried in. We don't think it has any symbolic purpose, but if you think that's a weird looking skeleton, it's because she's buried upside down or face down. So, the wood coffins were very rare, but they were there. And also here's a double burial. You can't see the skeletons, but there's, a larger one on top and then a smaller one down on the bottom of the picture. And in the middle, there's a big pot. It's a big pottery bowl, if you're wondering what that thing is. Oh, and the matting. This is stick matting, okay? So you can see all those little sticks that survived. They would have been all woven together and much better looking 3,000 years ago, but you got to give them a little credit there. And then here's some matting, and that's really interesting, beautiful, weird things that lasted for 3,000 years in the ground. Very annoying to excavate because you're afraid that everything's going to fall apart, which basically it would. So we took a lot of pictures we always take pictures anyway of everything in the ground before we remove it. But these ones, there was lots of special pictures taken so that you could see how they were weaved together in case the organics did not survive in the lab. Now let's get to the bones. The preservation was really great. I just like to show this picture because I thought it was funny. Half the bone was sun bleached and half was in the ground. So, preservation does depend on how deep you are in the ground and how much, your bones get exposed. We do have exceptional organic preservation aside from the skin. We had lots of hair. Really gross, just really unpleasant to deal with, and fingernails. I don't like that. I like bones, dry bones. Give me dry bones. I don't deal with the hair very well. It's kind of gross. We had hair extensions made out of other humans' hair. And if you guys recently, maybe in the past year, saw in the news that some cemeteries were found with wax, people that were buried with wax blobs on their head, and the wax blobs would trickle down during parties. They were perfumed wax things that would go into their wigs while they were partying because it was hot. That was found in Armana. So I didn't actually excavate any of that, but there were 2 or 3 women found with these wax things on their heads. So really interesting cemetery, beautiful preservation. Again, I'm not going to go through this list. This is just to show you that we don't just when we do what we call bioarchaeological data collection, we're not just looking at were they male or female. We're looking at male and female and comparing it to the rest of the population. We're looking at age. We're looking at any kind of trauma or disease. We're taking measurements to figure out how tall people were and also how much people grew at what ages. And that's a long, interesting story that I can tell you sometime if you want. We also looked at the teeth to learn about the diet and the health. We did all kinds of specialized studies. And so I just want you to know that we get the most data that we can out of these skeletons. And most people don't even think about how much you can get out of a skeleton. But here's your typical skeleton on the table, laid out nice, and all the paperwork that was associated with it is shown on the back wall. So I would say about 13 to 20 forms of paperwork go into each skeleton. And so what we learned about this cemetery, first of all, the first thing we noticed is that we had a lot of people that were in the ages when you shouldn't die. Okay, we had a lot of young people. Have you, I mean, in any cemetery in the whole wide world, where you see the most deaths is the very earliest, the babies, because nutrition back then and there wasn't modern medicine. So you usually, this is like almost like an upside down curve that you would see for ages. So we didn't have, I mean, we still had a lot of dead young babies, but more of what we had were the 18 to 45-year-olds. And that's not generally a normal age bracket that you would see in the ground. And so we immediately knew something was up. We immediately thought, well, that's weird. And then we started looking at the actual other kinds of measurements. We took measurements of the leg, the thigh bone, the femur. We took measurements of all the bones, but the femur itself is a good proxy for how tall the person was in life. It's kind of like the most accurate bone to tell. If you want a really quick estimate of how tall people were, you measure the femur. Then there's all kinds of other specialized measurements that you can get tallness from too. But basically, this is a long, big bar graph. But I want you to understand that Amarna, where the red arrow is on the bottom, has the shortest people of any of the samples from all over Egypt at all different time periods. I know this is not like an exhaustive group, but it is, it's good enough to show that even during the early dynastic and the old kingdom, the middle kingdom, when Egypt wasn't really like that rich and that prosperous, they still had taller people with better nutrition. And the shortness comes from, I should have explained that, the shortness comes from poor nutrition. Okay, so it's a link, it's a proxy to nutrition, to show us really quickly on the scale how if people are not reaching their growth potential, then they're not getting good enough nutrition. So of all the time periods before and after, Amarna is the shortest group of people. So it infers a poor quality of life. And so we start to see a different story being told by the actual people themselves, as opposed to the tomb paintings and the overall story that we've always told about everybody in the new kingdom. So another thing we look at is diet and nutrition. If you can see the lines on these front teeth, those mean that they had arrested development of their growth during childhood. And the same thing goes with the tibia. You can't see it that great, I guess, on the screen, but on the very bottom of the tibia, there are some lines, and those also indicate, those are your lower leg bones, by the way, x-rays, and the lines across also indicate growth arrested development. And we have iron deficiency anemia. Now, there's lots of cracks going on the roof of the eye holes in the skull. I can't believe I just said eye holes. That's the weirdest thing I've ever said. Eye orbits. But where the arrows are pointing to this porous bone, that happened in life. And that is from iron deficiency. Again, a nutritional deficiency. And when you map it out among a couple of other samples, Amarna, again, has the highest rate of what we call cribber orbitalia. That's the iron deficiency anemia. So sick people, hard-working people, major joint diseases, those middle vertebrae that are sitting on top of that scale, they have really popcorn crazy like edges, and it really should be like the edge on the leftmost largest vertebra on the left there. It should all be nice and smooth, and instead they have major back problems. And we're talking so major that, believe it or not, the picture on the right of the collapsed vertebra is from an 18-year-old person. So we are seeing major overwork, probably from quarrying the stones that came out for building the temples. But these teenagers were working their butts off, or their backs off, I should say. We've got herniated discs. We've got all kinds of nasty back trauma, all that stuff that looks melted and growing together is ankylosing spondylolysis, and it's gross and terrible. And we also have arthritis. So this is the humerus, the top of the arm bone. And on the left-hand side is no problem. There's like rotator cuff stuff. So if anybody's had rotator cuff surgery, this is what you're up against. On the right-hand side, I'll click a thing and you'll see a purple spot where the arthritis is showing. Okay, so you can see that. So that's where all the arthritis is. And so those edges there indicate, slight to moderate arthritis. And that's, the Egyptians didn't work very hard. They had a really nice land and lots of, good soil and stuff. So they didn't really normally have to work so hard. So this is an example of a very hardworking population from Egypt. These are the back of 2 kneecaps that are just destroyed and chunked from arthritis. Broken ribs, fractured bones. The weirdest one we have is on the left-hand side is a human scapula or shoulder blade. And on the right-hand side is a pig shoulder blade from the city. We didn't find the pig scapula in the cemetery. It was from the city, from the trash heaps. They have the same weird holes in them. And we have, I think, about now 10 men with these weird holes. And I think there's 3 or 4 pigs. And the holes are actually indicative of some kind of weird penetrating trauma. Like they basically got stabbed in the back. And we don't know why. And they healed. Okay, these are healed traumas. So we don't know what's going on, but there's something weird going on at Amarna, especially in the South Tomb Cemetery, because these folks were hardworking, dying young, had weird trauma. And so it was a very interesting cemetery. And basically, their new story that we tell is that life wasn't all peaches and cream at the capital city during the new kingdom, capital city of Amarna. So the non-elites, we don't have the elites to look at, but the major population of the city compared to lots of other major populations during different time periods in Egypt had a really tough time, and their story is completely different from the pictures that we see on the tomb walls of abundance and good times and parties. So that's our story that we were able to tell through the archaeology. And so I would love for Bailey to kind of follow up on your theme, to kind of, since we're kicking off your summer reading theme to telling, imagine your story. So I'll leave it at that. Here's just a picture of where the bones live from year to year in the boxes in the top of our storage magazine in Amarna. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we can go back to everybody that's here, and we can see if there are any questions. Y'all can unmute yourselves, or Bailey can just unmute. I see there's not too many questions because there's not very many of us. So you can just go ahead, and if you want to ask any questions, just unmute yourself if you'd like. So that's the story. There you go.
Really? No questions? No one's got a question after all of that?
And all of the people in the Zoom room,
Oh my God.
all 5 of us.
What's happening in here? Well, if no one's got any questions, we can go ahead and wrap it up. But I want to thank you guys for coming out to our very first program. I want to thank Mel for doing an awesome program. I have to say, the minute you said ancient Egypt, I just stopped listening and went, yes. As a small child, I wanted to be an Egyptologist more than anything. So yeah, give me all the Egypt. So
thanks. Yeah.
No
well,
questions.
how does this connect to your summer reading program? Tell me about the theme.
So our theme, this year's theme is Imagine Your Story, which really, I kind of like this theme because it's so broad.
Yeah.
They kind of lean more towards fairy tales, but we have, our folk tales. Just everybody has your own story. And I really loved your idea of bringing in archaeology as storytelling, because that's what it is. You are uncovering stories of these people who lived thousands of years ago, but their stories are still alive. You just have to find them. And I just think that's really awesome.
Yeah, that's what archaeology is about. And that's why we try to preserve sites, so that as the technology grows better, we can read the stories more accurately. So, for example, if the cemeteries were dug up in the 1920s, all of the bones would have been gone because they didn't realize back in the 1920s that you could learn so much about a person from their bones. So they were just digging up cemeteries, maybe keeping like cool skulls or something, but otherwise literally tossing the bones. We have no idea where. So there were cemeteries that were dug up, you know, in the 1920s that of hundreds of individuals, and all of the, you know, skeletons are gone. And in the same way here in America, of course, in Arkansas, we have folks that dig stuff up all the time, and it kind of messes up the story. If you take one piece of the puzzle away, the story gets less and less accurate. Yeah. So that my spiel as an archaeologist is always, please leave everything where you found it. Take pictures. It's like the leave no trace thing. Take nothing but pictures. You know, so anyway, that's oh no, we have somebody that just wanted to join now, so she missed the talk, but we can admit her anyway. But anyway, so yeah, so that's how we tell our story, and you know, I hope you all have fun telling your own stories this summer.
All right, still no questions? Nobody?
Well, like I said, I recorded this, and I'll stop recording when we finish everything, and people can feel free. I should have put my number or something on here, but if anybody does have questions after watching the talk again, they're welcome to contact me. Just ask Bailey, and Bailey, you're absolutely welcome to send my email or my phone number to anybody you want. So
will do.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Mel, again for our lovely talk, and hopefully we'll see you guys around next time we throw together a talk. Thank you guys.
All right. Everybody stay safe.